hello everyone. We are thankful to God that we're gathered again in another session of the series of our conferences called The Fact. Yes, we have a name now. I'm Fatima, and we're so honored to have very distinguished guests today from different parts of the world. Before we start our talk, let me introduce our guests first. I have Teresa Correa from the US. We're waiting for one other guest, Mariam Malakuti, and hope she can attend the conference and she can join us. Welcome everyone to The Fact. Okay, before going to the questions, I would like to give you a little summary of what we're going to talk about. As you know, there has been many years that the US has been claiming for being the first and the best country that provides human rights for everyone in each country and considers itself as the land of freedom. But there has been some contradictions in this claim concerning the rights of the colored people, women's rights, and religious minorities, and the status of violence and imprisonment in the US, which are going to be discussed in here in more details. Before going to the questions, I would like to introduce my co-host Ali to you. He's going to help me in hosting the conference. Ali, could you please turn on your video for a bit?
Yes, of course. I'm so honored to be here as the co-host of Lady Bidar in here, and
Thank you.
definitely I hope that it will be a great talk.
I hope so too. Thank you, Ali. Okay,
You're welcome.
let's start with Mr. Anderson. Tim, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Fatima. Hello.
Hello. Welcome to this conference and welcome to The Fact this time. This is The Fact, the first episode of The Fact. We're going to have a name. Tim, as you know, it's been a while that we've been witnessing protests among black people known as Ferguson. What's your idea about Ferguson protests? Where does this issue come from and what are its roots?
Thank you for the question, Fatima. Yes, the shooting of a young man by police in Ferguson County is important, not because it was a single event, but because it reflects a much deeper pattern of events there. There's been a string of shooting of mainly young black men in the United States in recent times, but to understand it properly, we have to look at the whole history of the US and its race relations. You know that slavery existed in the United States for many centuries, that it wasn't abolished with the independence of the United States. In fact, many of the founders of the US and their very fine rhetoric about freedom and individual rights, they were slaveholders. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence about all men being free and equal. George Washington, the great general of independence, was a large slaveholder. So that history is very important to understand. Also, it's often said that the US Civil War, some 85 years after independence, abolished slavery. In some respects that's true, in some respects it's not. If you read the history of what was called Reconstruction in the United States, there was no substantial reform benefiting African Americans at that time. In other words, the land reform, other things failed at that time. And new systems of racial segregation, racial discrimination were created, including jailing a lot of young black men and turning them into a workforce for the existing mines and plantations and so on. In other words, the abolition of slavery didn't really change race relations as substantially as might be thought. That went on until the 1960s, really, certainly until the Second World War, but also, you know, there were civil rights movements and so on. So that very long history means the culture of the US and its race relations are quite specific in the world. You know, there's racism in other parts of the world. There's racism in police killings and police being unaccountable for killing black men in particular. But general racial discrimination in the US, we have to reflect on that very long history.
Thank you. How much do you think has the US been successful in applying the justice and providing racial equality in the country?
Well, there have been some gains. There were gains in the 1960s because black people themselves, as you know, in the civil rights movement, demanded the elimination of racially discriminatory practices, which were very deeply entrenched in the 1960s. There were some breakthroughs in the formal rights of African American people then, but in practice, the situation hasn't changed so quickly. There's a very deep historical basis to this discrimination, and there's been a poor recognition, really, I suppose you'd say, of the legacy of slavery, the legacy of what we'll call the Jim Crow laws, the entrenched racial discrimination after slavery. So, individual African American people have made it through to senior positions in North America, but there's still a great deal of segregation. If you look at the county of Ferguson, for example, it was in a general part of the country which is perhaps 70% white, 30% black. But Ferguson itself is 2/3 black. If you go to Los Angeles or a lot of other major US cities today, you see a very deep segregation of communities. It's quite different to what you'd see in some other countries, even countries that have problems of racism. So that segregation, the economic disadvantage, the practices of police, there's also a great culture of violence in the United States for other reasons. Those sort of legacies are the things behind these very particular North American problems of racism and brutality.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. Now let's go to Mr. Opuskolski. Michael, can you hear me?
Yes. Salam alaikum.
Hello. Hello. Welcome to The Facts. We are so honored to have you here.
Shukran.
Thank you. Michael, considering this Ferguson issue, do you think is it legal or logical that the police have an absolute power in controlling protests in a violent way?
In my point of view, this is a long story, and it goes very deep into North American history. Mm-hmm. The Army, Police, National Guard are heavily armed. Why? Because they are principally directed against its own people. So therefore we have to talk about imperialism in the United States. What does imperialism mean? It means being extremely repressive internally and aggressive externally. And the combination of both factors make it. So you have many stories, and we could continue to talk about it for 2, 3, 4 days, and we would not end the story that the people, popular movements, popular uprisings, popular organizations, minorities were heavily suppressed by the state, using the army, using the police, using the National Guard, and sometimes even executions. I just remind you of officially legal trials that were based on fabricated accusations, for example, against Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is, I think, a very known figure. But there are many figures like him who are either still in the prison or who are either dead. Take, for example, the Nation of Islam, the American Islamic Brothers, who were really suppressed by the heavily armed police gangs, as well as the National Guard. Take the Black Panther movement, the Afro-American movement, that was nearly, take the so-called Hispanic-speaking, Spanish-speaking Americans, North Americans, they were facing a similar fate. So what it means, whenever people try to organize themselves, try to change the society towards more democracy, more equality, etc., They were immediately confronted by the state and its apparatus. And this is a long, long story.
So, Michael, do you
In my
believe that
point of view,
do you believe that all the protests that you have mentioned have been against the something that we call the imperialist oppression, right?
basically, yes, yes. And this can be proved because there were statements by some of the leaders of the Afro-Americans, so the Muslim leaders in the United States, Malcolm X, the very famous one, but not only the famous one, the people on the ground who were clearly, openly, publicly directed against the system as it is. You might not fully agree with all what these people say and said in the past, but basically they were protesting against the system, and therefore the system reacted so aggressively against them. Take into consideration some of the migrant workers who started to organize themselves even decades ago. The case of Sacco and Vanzetti, very famous case, worldwide known. Two people who were organizing the workers, and they were executed under fabricated FBI charges. So this is daily life.
I have to speak up, you guys. I have to speak up.
Yes,
In this
Teresa.
whole entire, I am the only person here who is actually an American. I am the only person here who has spent my entire life here. Sacco and Vanzetti have been dead 80 years. Malcolm X has been dead 40 years. In Ferguson, their riots were about racism and police brutality, but imperialism, almost zero. When they had their riots in Ferguson, even though it was very justified because of what they did to Michael Brown, they burned down shops of black brothers and sisters. And there was rioting and looting of homes of black brothers and sisters. So the knowledge about imperialism that existed 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago with Sacco and Vanzetti and Malcolm X and all that is not prevalent. And I'm the only person in those marches in this entire group, and you guys are not accurate. I'm the only person who's lived here my entire life and been active, and it is not consciously anti-imperialist anymore. I mean, the last time I saw any leadership that was consciously anti-imperialist was probably in the 1970s or 80s. I mean, people here are about economic struggle, economic survival, but they have almost no identification of who has caused those economic problems. But the racism that they're aiming at doesn't seem to be focused either, because I have been in those schools, I have lived in those communities my entire life, and you have blacks attacking Latinos, you have Latinos attacking blacks, you have Asians attacking Muslims, you have everybody attacking Muslims. I am a fairly brown-skinned Italian. I have been chased down the streets by African Americans, and they have called me an Iranian.
So
okay?
who's Teresa? Who's responsible for all this?
Okay, obviously the government is, but if you think that the movement is at all imperialistically aware or there's imperialistic calls, they are few and far between. You will see a few Marxist groups in the corner that nobody's talking to, passing out flyers about imperialism. Of course, United States government is responsible for all of this, but you also have in the United States government people like Condoleezza Rice and other black individuals who were very prevalent in the sellout, who is African American, and many of his aides and assistants are African American. They are not aware about imperialism. So let's not be talking about Sacco and Vanzetti, who've been dead longer than anybody on this panel even knows about. I mean, and Malcolm X has been dead. Okay, obviously the American government is at fault. obviously the American government is about imperialism and wants to have